Okay, well, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today for this seminar of the Illiberalism Studies program here at GW. My name is Marlene Larel. I'm the director of the program, and I'm delighted to have with us... Sorry.
I'm so sorry to bother. Do you have Wi-Fi? I can't take notes on my talks without.
John?
The intro.
There's a room.
Okay. Sorry.
I'm delighted to receive with us a good friend and colleague, Robert Shefford, who was teaching here at GW and has been a good fellow at GW, is the editor-in-chief of the journal Critical Asian Studies. He has been working on China, Indonesia, Nepal, a very good specialist on Asia, but we are here to discuss not specifically Asia, but his latest book called Beyond Illiberalism, Rhetoric and Reality in a Pluralistic World, which I think is a really great contribution to the debates that we have usually at the Liberalism Studies program, because he's bringing his knowledge of Asia to put us into the discussion about the way we use liberalism and illiberalism very much in a very normative way that tend to be a very Western-centric way, and is inviting us to try to look at the kind of long tradition of, thinking about rule of law, human rights as being in fact a product of Western domination and colonialism, and therefore the need for us to be thinking about what human rights can be in a more kind of local, non-Western context, about, depending on the culture you are, what is legitimate may be very different. So it's a very important, I think, book that allows us to kind of decenter from a Western-centric way about the discussion on liberalism versus illiberalism, and given the general context in which we are, both in the US but globally in the world, I think it's a really important discussion that the book is bringing to the table. So, Robert, welcome here. Really delighted to have you here. I give you the floor for some presentation of the book, and then we can have a conversation.
Thank you so much. And I'm just going to begin that on the flyer and notes also. I'm at the Foreign Service Institute with the State Department. And just to kind of be on the record, I'm a contractor, as most people at FSI are. And my work there is I work with a team to organize and run basically a semester-long seminar courses for foreign service officers who are going to be posted to the broader China region. So obviously what I'm saying here has nothing to do with the State Department or the current administration. So that's that, and I'm going to be quick. I'll speak maybe 15-20 minutes, I hope. So there's a lot of time so we can have a discussion. And I just want to begin with the title, Beyond Illiberalism. And I don't think of this book as a critique of the notion of illiberalism. I think illiberalism as a concept obviously has a place, and here's a good example of that place. In an institute that is primarily focused on, broadly speaking, the post-Soviet space. So in other words, places that actually in the past have had, to some extent, a tradition of liberalism in their societies and history. And that, again, would include everything from, the Czech Republic to Hungary to France to Germany to the UK, etc. Right? So my view is that in that heartland of 19th century liberalism, illiberalism is a very important concept, because to me it's addressing this phenomena of emerging movements that are actually rejecting liberalism, right, to some extent, or completely. My critique then is aimed not then at places like this, but more broadly, particularly among political scientists in general. I come out of cultural studies anthropology, so my apologies, I don't want to sound like I'm anti-political science. But the way in which the term has become so promiscuously used globally. And you just sort of do a Google search and say things like, is China illiberal? Yes. Bhutan? Yes. Rwanda? Yes. Saudi Arabia? Very much yes. Right? And you could go down the list, and it's quite interesting. And what I find baffling is how societies or states can be critiqued for being illiberal when there has never been a liberal tradition in these places. That's sort of like critiquing this country for being anti-Confucian, because we don't have a Confucian social political framework to think about politics. When it, obviously, if someone posed that critique to many Americans, they would say, well, that makes no sense. We've never had a Confucian framework. So that's really, I mean, we'll come back to this, we can talk about it, but that's really what I'm thinking about in terms of the title, just thinking beyond this box of this Manichean world in which suddenly there are either liberals or illiberals, and the latter are the bad people, right? As I said, I come to this out of anthropology, and I spent probably almost 20 years teaching undergraduate courses on human rights here in this building. And what I sort of came to realize over the years were so many of my students came to the course with strong values on the efficacy and moral standing of human rights. And yet, like many of Americans, many of my students actually, it seems they had never actually even read the international human rights documents, beginning with the UDHR in 1948. And then, according to the UN, depending on what you read, either between the 6 to 9 covenants/conventions that have followed since the 60s to frame this out, which was intriguing to me, of people who were vested in a worldview in which they actually hadn't spent much time reading what this worldview. And if you've spent time in post-colonial states, the irony is that in many of those places, there's much more knowledge, even at the micro level, about the language of human rights because it's part of the curriculum, right down in elementary school, right? So that sort of got me into thinking about writing this book. And, over the course of my career too, and, I've always thought of myself as a pragmatist, but to me, it's hard not to look at the international human rights industry, that's what it is, I think, and not recognize that, if we're being fair and balanced, the entire thing is built on 19th-century liberalism, right? Which is fine, but to claim then this set of values should therefore be universal, we're moving out of the space of policy into the space of almost kind of a secular form of religious belief, right? And you see this with the kind of standard critiques of human rights. So there's an ontological debate, which some mainly non-Euro-American scholars point out. Well, if human rights are universal, why were they only so-called, quote, discovered in the Enlightenment, right? And then there is a, sort of the moral ethical point of saying, well, why is it that only when imperial states were losing their colonies did policymakers discover human rights were important, right? So you end up with this catch-22, and again, as Marlene said, the places I know best are in Asia, where I spent quite a long time. In a country like Indonesia, which was the first colonial revolution that succeeded. It began in 1945, right, when the Dutch, think of this, the Dutch, they collapse and they are occupied by Germany within a week of the war breaking out. The first thing they do in 1945, when they have freedom, is to raise an army to attempt to reconquer the East Indies, right? And again, you don't have to be a moralist to say, how do you square this circle? Like in Europe, you're sitting there at these meetings talking about this post-war world of some kind of collaborative values based on this thing called human rights. And then you've just gone to war against your colonial subjects. And that war only ended in 1949. It was the first Vietnam when you look at what happened there. Right? And there was a lot of atrocities on both sides. But, when you look at the history of post-colonialism, beginning in the 50s, suddenly the catch-22 contradiction is, now that you're independent and you've won your freedom, you have to buy into universal human rights, right? And we've decided what those are, right? So that's I'm just sort of putting things out here from the book, and the way I think about this is through anthropology. And if you've followed the debates on human rights, one of the I think unfortunate aspects of this is that for too long it was left to the domain of philosophers, particularly European American philosophers who, no offense against philosophers, but if you're a philosopher, you don't need to worry about real time, right? And you don't have to mess around with the messy cultural context of the messiness of social reality, right? You can just think about humans in the abstract. And for a long time, anthropology as a discipline opted out of human rights debates for what I think is one clear reason, the vexing concept of cultural relativism, which particularly in this country has been reduced to cultural determinism. So, first of all, many Americans don't even know what it means, right? But what I'm struck often by in academia, and particularly among human rights advocates, is this idea that a cultural relativist simply is a determinist. That they're saying, you're born into a society, you are born into China, so therefore you have a Confucian mindset, and that will never change. And anthropologists have never said that. That makes absolutely no sense at all, right? What anthropologists have said is that we're not born blank slates. There is no universal man or woman. That we're born into specific places, into specific value sets and religious systems, and we don't choose that. We're born into it. That doesn't mean that it controls us, these things. But for someone to claim that that framework has no impact on how they see the world, I think most anthropologists would say, I'm sorry, but that doesn't make much sense, right? And for a long time, these were theoretical debates, weren't they? And they would happen in here, places like this, and have people taking different positions. What's really changed it is what has happened, beginning with Singapore in the 80s and 90s, and now with the People's Republic of China. For a long time, it was really easy to dismiss critiques of universal human rights by simply saying everything else has failed, right? The Soviet Union, well, it never actually could feed itself, right? Think of that, the contradiction of the Soviet Union. It was leading the socialist world. It was importing grain from its capitalist enemy, right? But when you look at a place like Singapore, and has anyone been to Singapore?
I have friends from there.
Okay. And if you read about it, it's one of, I find it intriguing how, and you see the same thing with China now. A lot of human rights advocates, there's almost like this grudge. Like, these places are not supposed to work the way they do, right? When I point out, I went to live in China in 1989, right after Tiananmen Square. And that China was closer to the DPRK in terms of everyday life than anything what China looks like today. So the people I know in China are like me, they're old. And when I'm back with them and we're drinking beer and eating hot pot and, people being old complain a lot. And they complain about their kids and they say, young Chinese are lazy. They don't know how hard we had it. But what they can agree on is that they, to the person that I know, they could never, back in the early 90s, imagine the lives they can have today in terms of personal agency and material security, right? And this has not happened because of liberalism or universal values. It's a result of a lot of very complicated factors. I'm going to say one more thing because I want to leave a lot of times to talk about this, and give them 20 minutes. So we have the factual reality now, that there are increasing places in the world that have not ever been liberal and are turning away from making it clear. And again, the People's Republic of China, the Chinese Communist Party isn't a mystery. They are very upfront about what they plan to do and what they do. Right? You just need to read their documents. Read the Chinese Constitution, read the Communist Party Constitution. Right? They make it clear. They are not going to become a liberal democracy, or what they call, quote, bourgeois liberalism. Right? My colleague at G.W., if many of you probably know him or taken a course with him, Dr. Shambaugh, David Shambaugh. His most recent book, I highly recommend it, it's called Broken Entanglements, Broken Engagement. And he's kind of looking at the arc of the China-US relationship since the 80s. And he's pointing out the fallacy that a lot of Chinese US analysts and government people, and even everyday Americans, seem to have had for a long time, that in engaging with China and trading with China and having human exchange with China and cultural exchanges and bringing China into the international world, they will become like us. Right? My question always has been, since 1989 when I started living there, is why would anyone ever have thought that would happen? Right? I mean, when you think of that, the idea that the I don't want to say the arrogance, but the strangeness of that idea, that I will be your friend, because in being your friend, you will completely reject all your own values and you'll become just like me. And if you were a Communist Party official, then it's even more bizarre, because people in China read the news. And it never was a secret among Chinese policy analysts that, yeah, the US position, both parties for a long time, from Nixon all the way to the first Trump administration, was this is good for us. Yes, there's a trade deficit. Yes, there's a lot of sketchy stuff with the WTO, where the Chinese government seems to be cutting corners and not cheating. But don't worry, because in the end, they become like us. If you're a Communist Party official and you're sitting in Beijing or in Zhongnanhai where the party is, you're like, okay, so you're telling me the goal of your policy is to destroy us, to eliminate me, the Communist Party. Right? Which, by the way, I haven't met a communist in the Communist Party in 20 years. Right? They're more communist in Berkeley or Boulder than in Beijing, for sure. And then I'm going to say one more thing, and back to theory. Two people I think are really important to read when it comes to thinking about these issues is an anthropologist named Mel Hurkovitz. Was active, from the 30s up until the 60s. Fantastic progressive credentials. He's one of the founders of African American Studies in the United States, a lifelong civil rights activist. And the other is Hannah Arendt, who I think is the greatest philosopher of the 20th century, and unfortunately is ignored very much in these days when we need her. Mm-hmm. And Hurkovitz, in 1947, wrote a short article in response to a query from the committee headed by Eleanor Roosevelt that was drawing up the UDHR. They were soliciting input from experts. And he was the president of the American Anthropological Association at the time, right? A very important person. They say, give us your take. And he wrote this quite harsh critique, right? Beginning with the premise of, this is kind of like sketchy to say the least. Like, colonialism is ending, and now you're imposing a new form of colonialism. Right? You're mandating that, all in the world should live by these values. The other thing he said was that no one has done the hard work. And what he meant by that was, if this is truly a document that will be based on universal values, where's the data? Who's gone off and tried to compile the data? And of course they hadn't. I mean, that's why the UDHR, much of it reads like the US Bill of Rights. Yeah. And then when you look at Hannah Arendt, I mean, if you know her background, she was one of the first women in Germany to get a doctorate in philosophy from Heidelberg which was the preeminent university in Europe at the time for philosophy. She studied under Martin Heidegger, who, you know your history, later became a Nazi, and although he was never convicted of any crimes. After the Nazis came to power, she and her mom and her then husband fled to Paris. And then when the German invasion of France began, they were one of the few Jewish intellectuals in France at the time who were able to get visas to the United States. So she ended up in New York, and she spent her career as a vagabond academic. You know, she taught at probably a dozen different schools. And in 1947, she was asked to comment on this Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which you would think, well, here's somebody who's going to support it, right? She's a German intellectual who survived the Nazis. She completely condemned this document. And she did it for one specific, her key point was, if human rights exist, why are the only people in the world who have no rights stateless people? And that is a question that human rights advocates continue to avoid to this day. And we see this with Palestine. Right? Palestinians have, beyond the conflict that's happening in the world at large, Palestinians are stateless people, right? So they depend, and what Aram was getting at is, and you know, she comes out of a Edmund Burke Rousseauian tradition of the Euro-American sort of philosophical canon, and she comes from the view that for a law to have standing, it has to be enforced. Otherwise, it's just words on paper. Mm-hmm. So, for a human right to be a right, there has to be a body that can make sure that you have that right. And her point was, the only rights we have are the rights that are given us to states. And what humans need is for a state to recognize them as worthy of rights. Right? And that, to my mind, that continues to be what I think of as the biggest flaw in the whole universal rights argument, right? These, you know, yes, we have conventions now, and we have 2 covenants for economic and social, cultural rights and political rights. And yes, under international law, these are all legally binding on the states that signed them. But we know they're not, right? And we know that when we look at who is brought to justice at the ICC, right? If you're a citizen of a powerful state, you're probably not going to end up there, right? So it seems like when it comes to international law is not blind, right? That politics and power really matter. So I'm going to end with this. I'm come full circle, and my view is that what is critical to conversations about rights is authentic sovereignty. That without being a member of a sovereign state, humans have no rights, right? We are dependent on the charity of others. And I don't want that to sound bleak, right? And I could never figure out the IR language. So I don't know if that makes me a realist or neo-realist or proto-realist or semi-realist. But, you know, from the anthropological view, I would say, no, I'm a cultural relativist. That, you know, for me to critique the way that the rights regime works in China, I need to know something about China. You know, and that's hard for rights advocates. That's not sexy. To spend your time focused on a specific place and trying to unpack what's going on there. And you know, it's much easier to critique, isn't it? So I'll stop there. I went 5 minutes over, I think.
No, but that's great. Thank you so much, Robert. I think you're bringing so many really great elements on the table, on the discussion, both on the human right aspect, but also on the illiberalism discussion, and we really miss this kind of, decentering voices that bring the kind of non-Western kind of perspective. I see really several key elements. The cultural relativism is not cultural determinism. I think is a really great point you have as a way to kind of deconstruct the usual arguments. I wanted maybe just one kind of question, and then we open the floor for the discussion. When you brought the example of Singapore and China and how now they are really kind of being growing, I wonder on how much we should be kind of dissociating the economic modernity, right? Because for very long, the liberal democracy was associated with economic prosperity.
Yeah.
I think that model is dead.
Yeah.
Like since at least 2007
Yeah.
economic crisis, if not before. So you can be a poor liberal democracy and economically you won't get prosperity. You can be a non-liberal democracy regime and have economic prosperity. So that links got decoupled, I think, very clearly. The question is that how do we frame so not the economic side of modernity, right? But how do we frame the kind of the personal agency element in a non-Western framework, right? So, okay, you can be economically successful in China without a liberal democratic framework. Okay, how do we frame the kind of, you have personal agency in your life in a non-liberal democratic framework, right? So how do we move away the economic modernization debates to have more the kind of cultural relativism aspect of the discussion, to not to shift to a narrative where we risk kind of overlapping with authoritarian practices or too much kind of, a civilizational narrative. And I say that as a Russia specialist who is also facing exactly what you face on China, right? That at which moment I myself as a scholar trying to explain from the inside of the Russian society how you can be a Russian citizen and feel okay with your personal agency the way the Russian state give you, even if from an external perspective it looks like, an authoritarian state. But from the inside of the society, you can feel pretty comfortable if you are not yourself an activist looking west. All right, so how do we try to think that without kind of then overlapping with the state policies and their repressing system?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't have an answer.
I
mean, I would say that, when we look at authoritarian states that survive and are stable and they survive because there is some response to the public, isn't there?
Yeah.
In particular ways. And, one of the things when it comes to China that I find fascinating is how, the current language of the Communist Party is that they're a law-driven society. And, from outside of China, that's dismissed as, you're not a rule of law society, you're a rule by law society. Meaning, the state and the party use the law to control society, which doesn't sound very different than my country right now. But, in that critique, what's missing, and I mentioned this book, is like, well, if this is all this lip-flapping, it doesn't mean anything, then how to explain the giant legal ecosphere that exists in China now that never existed 30 years ago? Hundreds of thousands of lawyers, a complex, multi-layered judicial system. There are informal legal practitioners. How to explain the fact that there are literally tens of thousands or thousands of non-government organizations in China, right? Because I know the critique is, well, they're all tied to the state. They have to be credentialed by the state, which is true. But then again, when I look at this country, it's remarkable how many NGOs in the United States have been dependent on federal money for so long. And I'm not saying that the federal government controls them, but clearly it complicates that narrative. Like, our NGOs are great because they're independent. Yours are not great. It ignores the fact that large numbers of Chinese citizens are active in social movements. So again, from an anthropology view, it's like, well, do we dismiss them as brainwashed or naive? That doesn't make sense because China's one of the most wired places in the world. To my mind, it's looking at these places like this, or when you look at a place like Singapore, it's, I think they're both different in Russia. Russia, it's like an authoritarian candidate, isn't it? It's a resource-rich country with a massive land base that the state has the ability to use these natural resources, doesn't it, to prop up the economy. And, the PRC doesn't have that. So, I mean, I guess to me it comes down to embracing diversity. Yeah, it's become a bad word in America, I know, but I'm all for diversity. When we look up globally, we went through that period from 1992 roughly, the collapse of the communist experiment in Europe. And, Francis Fukuyama told us the world history had ended, everybody's going to be a liberal Democrat. And by the way, he was actually, I was at George Mason over the river getting my PhD when he was there. So, he's a wonderful guy, amazing scholar, and made a career out of this one great theoretical hook, right?
Oh.
But then 2001 happened. So there was that snapshot of a decade in which liberal triumphalism was there. And I look at the world and it's like, well, we're returning to the world as it was in the 19th century. So hopefully without the imperialism, right? Of this very culturally and socially, politically diverse space. And, it connects to that modern infatuation with universals, isn't it? This universalist dream coming up from the 20s of this, if everything is the same, it's going to be better. I've never understood that. Why in the world would the world be better if we all had the same values and the same beliefs politically? Especially when the people who advocate for this often are the same people who believe in multiculturalism. So it's like, what does that mean though? I can be different from you as long as I first agree to be a liberal? Then how am I different? Right? And it's a more challenging world to accept on an equitable basis that there are very reasonable people who just have different worldviews, right? And it seems to me the biggest issue then is like making sure we don't kill each other over that, not trying to change each other's views, right? So, but that's why I'm not teaching human rights and ethics anymore. I probably couldn't. I'd be condemned. So, please give me your questions.
Yes,
come on, guys.
let's open the
You
floor.
disagree with me? Come on.
Yes.
What do you think are the biggest consequences of both assuming and also trying to enforce these universal value sets that are based in sort of Western ideology?
Well, let me ask you a question. Do you think are these
Trying to enforce.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Can they be enforced?
I don't know. You tell me.
Well, to me, no. We look at if sort of my regional basket is Southeast Asia and East Asia. When you look at a place like Hong Kong, well, should the U.S. government frame its foreign policy towards China around Hong Kong? Is it that important? Or should we accept the fact that Hong Kong is not going to be a liberal democratic state? It's never been, right? It was, the British never held an election until they signed a treaty to give it back to the PRC, right? So, but in terms of your question, I think clearly when we think of the interventions in Iraq and in Afghanistan, when President Bush, at the time, he framed those partly in the language of human rights. And people don't have to dismiss that like, oh, that's BS. It's about his dad, it's about oil, blah, blah, blah. It's more difficult to say, what if he actually believed that? What if he believed that in going in and destroying a country, you could paradoxically bring them human rights? And, to me, the tragedy, since human rights has become this powerful worldview, hundreds of thousands of people have died, not fighting for human rights, but dying in conflicts about human rights, right? And I can't think of any that have been successful. Some people say, well, Taiwan's a success. Well, Taiwan
was a dictatorship for
it was, and it's different today because Taiwanese changed it. It didn't change because the Americans or the Europeans, right? And that's, generations of Taiwanese fought, not literally fought, but they advocated for change, right? You look at a place like South Korea, it's difficult to support the claim that South Korea is a liberal democracy.
I mean, they had martial law there too.
Yeah. Well, also, it's the most Confucianist place in the world. And, Japan, I mean, one political party has held power pretty much since the 1950s.
Right.
But we just say, oh, they're a liberal democracy.
It's because they said it's because it's the Liberal Democratic Party that's holding power.
Yeah.
Yeah, because also you have a kind of confusion with being geopolitically oriented toward the West, right? So you can be, you don't necessarily need to be liberal democratic as long as you are kind of geopolitically oriented, you would fit into the categories. But if you would think about the kind of post-Soviet region, I would see there you had a backlash on what has been the kind of, at least the US foreign policy of kind of promotion of liberal democracy, and especially on all the gender kind of progressivism as backlashed. And there I think it was really, I mean, also in the Middle East, you could potentially think, but I think there have been really a mistake on some years of the US foreign policy at finding the right way of framing what is a liberal democracy in the US sense. Right? So, for example, the really heavy promotion of LGBT rights in, for example, a region I've been working on, like Central Asia, so heavily Muslim region, had a very strong backlash. While you could have imagined a US foreign policy that would have said, guys, in our country, the US, half of the population is for, half of the population is against. We have progressive, we have conservative, and still we can live together without fighting, and we find a way, to deal with our own internal diversity, and we invite you to deal with your own internal diversity. That could have been an option, right? To try to promote US own contradiction on that issue as a way on how you deal with pluralistic opinion on LGBT rights. The US foreign policy was heavily only progressivist. They got a backlash, right? So I think on some region that was very clearly kind of formulated, especially on the kind of the gender aspect.
I guess I have a follow-up. If it is not only not possible to enforce these kinds of universal human rights, but maybe not right to try and do so, is there a purpose, or what is the place of multilateral organizations like the UN?
Well, I mean, if we're honest, you look at the UN, it's structured on inequality, isn't it? I mean, it always has been. I mean, the fact that one of 5 permanent members can just veto something that the rest of the world agrees on, it just, to me, kind of shows that it's, maybe at the time that's what the best one could do, right? To the question of if it's right or wrong, the universal values, I'm not sure that's the right question. I would just say they just don't exist, right? And they haven't existed. And I mean, the political history of Europe and North America shows that. I mean, liberalism is a product of Europe, so is fascism and communism and socialism and anarchism, right, and syndicalism. So, I've always been a bit taken aback at how the complicated political history of that place is cleaned up by rights advocates. Like, yes, we're all for rights, right? So, I mean, to go back to Taiwan, I mean, maybe it's too simplistic, but I think, sovereign states, the people of sovereign spaces have the right to determine their own future and to hash out what their future will be In terms of international organizations, that's a really good question, because I mean, it's a very big industry now. It involves a lot of a lot of people who, it's like the World Bank. When you go by the World Bank at lunchtime, it is truly a diverse space, isn't it? But I've always kind of wondered, well, all these folks working at the World Bank, they seem to have a lot more in common with themselves than with the places that they come from. Right? Why isn't the World Bank in Dhaka? Or in Lagos, right? Why is it here? Right? If it's supposedly an institution that is dedicated to uplifting those who need uplifting, right? These are powerful institutions, not in terms of maybe political power, but they're bureaucracies, and bureaucracies are inherently conservative, right? And it's once a bureaucracy is sort of grounded in place, it's very difficult to get that to shift, right? I mean, universities are great for this. Universities are filled, no offense to G.W., but there are a lot of, politically progressive people who identify as progressive at GW who, sometimes you want to remind them, it's like, but you spend your life working in a caste system, haven't you? Like, you tenured people over here, you have lifetime employment, nothing can happen to you, right? Maybe if you get arrested, you get suspended with pay. And then you have all these underlings, like the grad assistants and the TAs and the contract faculty who keep the system going, right? I've never could figure out, how does a progressive person square the circle with that? But hey, I'm not here now. I spend my time on a beautiful little island off the coast of Virginia, so.
But maybe to go back on your question, what is happening now is that the delegitimation of the Western vision, right, of the liberal system is precisely what we were discussing, is that as long as there wouldn't be any redistribution in a more fair international system, the Western justification of the so-called liberal world order just doesn't work, right?
Yeah.
And so it's kind of.
I do also have to think, like, it hasn't been tested like this before, though, because previously, previous tests to the UN system, like, as long as the hegemon backs the effort to unseat what is this unpopular violation of human rights, then of course it would succeed. But now, like, with, for example, what's happening in Gaza, like the fact that like the U.S. keeps vetoing efforts to to move in and ameliorate the situation, that proves like this is a test of the system that like we've never really dealt with, because we've never had to go against the U.S.'s wishes on something like this.
Well, we've had examples before, haven't we? I mean, Xinjiang will never be taken up by the UN because the PRC will veto it. And during the Indonesian War of Independence, the French protected the Dutch. They just vetoed any time, although the UN eventually did get involved. But the French would just say, no, we're not going to talk about that. And I think the intriguing thing now, though, is I don't think it's so much of a test of a system. It's particularly the People's Republic of saying, we have standing globally. We want that to be reflected in these international institutions. And, I think European leaders, to some extent, but particularly U.S. leaders, find that quite threatening. When you look at the Belt and Road Initiative, the Chinese development, much of the critique doesn't make sense. The critique is, they don't take, you African countries don't take money from the Chinese because, if you can't pick the loan, they're going to take it back. It's like, no, they're not. I mean, they build a highway, they can't take it away. We learned this in the 60s, the U.S. did, right? What the Chinese are doing is it's completely, in almost a Trumpian way. It's very transactional, isn't it? They make it clear they don't care about politics. If your country has resources they need, they don't care if you're a democracy or a dictatorship or a kingdom. they'll do business with you. So it's a very different approach to international affairs. And because China now has standing, it is putting pressure on sort of the status quo, isn't it, I think?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, sorry if I can just add, I think the US has been kind of vetoing a lot of resolution on Israel over the last kind of 50 years. What you have now is that you have both Russia and China being much more vocal. Then you have all the kind of the other BRICS country becoming also kind of more visible and vocal. And then you have the US suddenly from the inside of the so-called liberal order kind of shifting the language up to the point of having one moment where the Trump US voted with Russia and China vetoing. So whereas the system is shaking because it's attacked from the inside and from the outside at the same moment.
Yeah, that's
the change.
That's a very big destabilization of like the norm. Yeah. I was also wondering. I had a question about like how do you think that with like the internet and the advent of like social media and all of that stuff, how has that like affected our like our understanding of liberalism, illiberalism, and also like can it like the power that it might have in getting people to accept illiberalism?
I mean, we've been, I'm old enough to know that, really for 20 years now we've been warned of the dangers of the internet and disinformation and, and not that it's not a huge problem, but, the data shows what do most people do online, right? They look at porn, they shop, they post stuff in social media circles among them friends. So to me, it's quite remarkable, relatively speaking, how little politics plays a role in that, doesn't it? And it's I think we're always looking for another rationale to explain why, not we, I shouldn't say that, but people who believe in a world in which there should be a seamlessly unified liberal international order, they're always looking for reasons to explain why that order doesn't exist, right? So, if you say, well, there are 800 to 900 million people online in China, well, they block the internet, which is like, actually, it's much more complicated than that, right? If you take, for example, things like VPNs. I was at a talk a few years ago by a Chinese scholar who was discussing what he saw as the European and American simplistic approach to internet censorship in a place like China, where they just simply promoted this idea that the Communist Party, which is incredibly inefficient in every other aspect of life, somehow is incredibly efficient when it comes to internet censorship. And he pointed out two things. One, he said, it's always the cat chasing the mouse. They're always reacting. So it's always constantly shifting landscape. But the other thing he pointed out is that VPNs, while illegal in China officially, you can't. Not only can you not do business, but just in everyday life, students in China, you need a VPN to access articles you need to write your papers, right? So it's a very big business, right? And he gave a number at the time. He calculated. He said 3% of people online in China, which at the time was about 600 million people, are using VPNs. That's probably 20 million people. It's probably much more. And the VPNs that you can buy in China typically are coming from Chinese guys who are in sketchy places like, P.O. boxes in the Maldives Islands, right? And it works out to be $10, $15 a month, right? So if you add that up, you're talking about a $3 to $4 billion a year industry. And his argument was, although he didn't have much evidence, was that it's perfectly logical that the PSB, the Chinese police, are actually heavily involved in this. Their job is to monitor the internet. What better way to monitor the internet than to monitor the people who are spending money to get around the monitoring of the internet? And in doing so, you create this lucrative financial trail on which you're literally getting billions of dollars. Right? And as bizarre as it sounds, in the context of China, yeah, I would say that actually makes a lot of sense, right? Because you don't need to arrest people. You're monitoring them, right? So that doesn't answer your question.
I guess, I mean, I was just curious. Yes.
There was another question.
Sorry, no, mine's backtracking a little bit, so if this is a follow-up, you're welcome to.
Then follow up maybe.
Yes, okay, perfect.
Yes.
Who-
Yeah,
you
go
have
on.
No, you can
Okay.
go. You can go.
Um, So I also don't want to be monopolizing.
Yeah, who else has a question? Come on.
Okay.
You got a question.
I wanted to disagree with you on something.
Yes, please. I love it when people disagree with me.
Uh,
And then we come back to you.
Yes.
Is that okay?
Yes, no, please
Okay.
do. Please. I've
You-
asked like 4 questions, so.
You were saying that the internet does not have such a big effect on politics
No.
earlier, right? Did I understand that right? Or
No, I was saying that most people in most places, it seems based on the data, are engaged in very non-political activities online. So I was critiquing the idea that the internet is this thing that now dominates sort of the political sphere. But go ahead.
But I'm going back to the elections in Romania that happened now last year,
Okay.
which were mostly driven by TikTok and shorts and the Reels format of internet, where people, even though browsing non-political material, came across, were fed political material,
Yep.
and that swayed majorly the election results to the point that they were cancelled, and there was a whole debacle
Yeah.
about that. So I'm wondering, even though you're saying that people consciously don't use internet, which you're right, don't use internet for political reasons, when we're seeing algorithm-based technologies feeding people political content because certain actors maybe have an interest for that to happen, is the internet going to become a sort of a politicized tool that it's regulating and so on and so forth?
No, I would agree with you. It is clearly a politicized tool. But then, how is this not? It seems like it's a 21st century hyper-efficient tool that mirrors what you would see in late 19th century print journalism. When in Europe and the United States, most newspapers were profoundly partisan, right? That's why cities had 3, 4, 5 different papers, because this one tells you one worldview, that this one tells you different. So in a way, politics has always been like this, isn't it? That it's a much more effective way now to try to not control people's mindset, but to capture them and to feed them one perspective. So isn't the answer to counter propaganda you counter with your own propaganda? Is there any other way around it? That's what because that's what would happen in print journalism, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
That's a really bleak view I have.
Can I just join also? In 1 minute, I think thinking that kind of social media polarization explained the collapse or the failure of people supporting liberalism is the mistake, right? If liberalism is failing, it's failing for reason that people feel like in their everyday life, social, economic, prosperity, whatever, it doesn't work anymore for them. And then you have an amplifying effect that can arrive by social media. But I think it's dangerous to think that people, through what they read, have this kind of, mediated vision, and that wouldn't be connected to the reality of their social, economic, environment. I think people can interpret what is happening in their environment and feel dissatisfaction with it. And then you may have the polarization effect, which I think is indeed there, but was already there. I think we are just kind of clothing the parenthesis that the kind of Fukuyama think that there was a moment of very deep technocratization, depolitization, there is no alternative, there is only one way of being. But that was not the case before. Before you had very strong parties. And now suddenly we are rediscovering that no, there are ideologies, contradiction, and people disagree on important things. So it's a kind of rediscovery after this kind of post-ideological moments. So that would be, I think, the kind of.
I guess my thought on that would probably be that people do see that like the world is, there's like serious problems in the world, but what causes one person to see that problem and go left, and what causes another person to see that same problem and go right. And that's probably like why like the social media polarization is such an issue right now, is because like differing worldviews like tell you the causes of these issues with the liberal system. Like there are different, like for the left and for the right, there are different causes.
But it's not media who tell you one or the other.
I feel like the media is amplifying this belief that
if you are left, you can watch Fox News the whole day. That will not make you voting Trump.
No, of course not.
Right.
I was just saying that like
media are reinforcing your own already orientation, but your own ideological orientation is based on your own socialization. The media is accentuating it. It's not making you kind of.
But the question is like, who are you socializing with as a result of this media consumption? Because if you've watched Fox News so much that you like all of your friends have decided you're crazy and they leave you, then who are your new friends?
Fox News watchers.
I also disagree. So you mainly criticizing this liberal worldview imposing their values on the rest of the world, but so this is like in general modernization theory, right? I mean, it was modernization theory, and I think we like at least the literature has moved long ago on this issue, and also like in practice, I don't see like in practice that was the case, like United States on purpose or the Western world imposing values systematically on everyone. It was always selective, you know. I mean, that was always like in practice. It's different. It's not like there is like one linear approach on this. And also like when we talk about like China or other authoritarian regimes or illiberal regimes, like portraying themselves like, well, we are different and this should be the multicultural world order, blah blah blah, but we are actually ignoring the voice of people as well. Like we are, like those authoritarian regimes also legitimizing their authoritarian rules based on this narrative, right? For example, in Belarus, people were against, like they tried to topple their regime and it didn't happen. And in Ukraine as well, like they tried Orange Revolution, they tried Euromaidan Revolution, but the West was like more or less the West was silent, like who was actually helping. So like in any case, the real world, I don't think it's like the Western world was systematically imposing their values on the rest of the world or on illiberal regimes.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's obviously there are places in which, and I guess I should backtrack and say I'm not really focused on what the U.S. government is doing. I mean, my interest has always been more in the sort of the transnational, multilateral human rights industry. And with that, I think, and to echo Marlene here, you know, why are there NGOs, you know, going to, when I was at G.W., this is a social example, it was around the time that Americans suddenly discovered gay rights, and suddenly Americans were like, oh yeah, gay rights, we're great, we believe in them. And then there was that moment was, you know, suddenly we had to start policing the world. and it was, when I was here, there was this strong undergraduate student focus in Uganda. It's like the evil empire of anti-gay legislation. And there didn't seem to be students that I had that knew anything about Uganda, right? Or the actual social reality of Uganda. Obviously, there have always been gay people in Uganda, or in any place, right? That's just a biological fact, right? And again, the anthropological view would be, well, the hard work is trying to figure out. My work in China, I had a student, G.W.F, he did this. He went to China on a Fulbright to try to figure out, what does it mean to be a gay man in urban China, right? In an authoritarian regime. What was the reality there? And, my critique of the human rights sort of industry is that hard work they just ignore. They start with the answers. It's like, we know we're right, and that you're flawed, if you have these policies.
It's giving missionary.
Yeah, and in terms of, are you from Belarus? Or?
No.
Okay. But in terms of Belarus, it's like, well, I don't know anything about it, and if I would assume that if a political change happens, it'll be driven by the people of Belarus, right? And not what outside people are saying or doing.
Yeah, I mean, that's the point. They tried their hard. I mean,
Yeah.
their best. They tried. Now it's happening in Georgia already. Like
Yeah.
a couple of months, it's happening. And
It means
happening.
the West is not always supportive,
Yes, this
even
is
when
Yeah.
they are
Like,
movement.
yeah,
Yeah, the West is
already-
selective.
Yes, select.
Well,
Very
Yeah.
selective.
that's part of the, I dare say, the orientalization behind all this, that the unspoken, these are Europeans, right? And that's another thing we haven't talked about, but, in the post-colonial world in which, some states or some societies seem to be more targets, right? I've always been struck by, in my field in China studies, how many, particularly US-based China scholars, are just anti-China. It's perplexing. They spend their life studying the society, and yet they're just hypercritical, autocritical of everything about China. And it's like, well, I don't know who the audience is. The audience seems to be not Chinese. I mean, you don't know that. Like, to go to somebody and say, your country sucks, let's be friends. So it seems like the audience is themselves, to convince themselves, And now here we are in DC in 2025, and I can't tell the difference between a Democrat and a Republican when it comes to China. We're back to the McCarthy era, and we had a few years ago the Confucius Institute here. Yeah, it's gone. Why? Well, they're brainwashing GW students. What? Are GW students that susceptible that they're going to go to a Confucius Institute event and come out supporting Chinese control of Tibet?
They still the Taiwanese one?
Unfortunately, so we still have time to continue the discussion, but we will have to do it in a more kind of informal setting,
Okay.
because officially we have to stop here. So thank you so much for joining us for the event. Robert, your book is just creating
Yeah.
a lot of discussion that I think are super vital now, and that people are kind of thirsty for that kind of discussion. I invite you to stay here and
Yeah, I
continue
can
the
stay.
discussion.
I don't have to leave
Please,
at 5:30,
but
so if you
yeah,
want to...
please join me in thanking Robert for the
Thank you
official
all for
part
coming. Thank you for
of the discussion.